Right, let's get going. Hello to everyone watching. You made it to the second stream. This time we're going to be analysing a very very historic, famous game between IBM's Deep Blue and Mr. Garry Kasparov. I've got a nice picture. On the left there, playing the black pieces, Mr. Garry Kasparov, and on the right, some bloke from IBM relaying IBM's moves onto the board. The history behind this match is that it was played in 1996 and a rematch was played in 1997. At the time, there was a lot of doubt over whether computers could basically brute force beating a human at chess. People like to think it was a bit more creative and a bit more stylish. Obviously, we know now that actually computers completely outclass us, but back then it was very much on the cards for humans to still be better. This is game one of the 1996 match, so let's just dive straight in. So IBM is playing the white pieces and Garry is playing the black pieces. So e4, pretty standard opening stuff. That's how we teach the kids to open. Get their knight out, get the bishops out, pawn here, and bring your other bishop out. But Garry goes for c5, the Sicilian, and already a pretty interesting move on move 2 by Deep Blue, c3. The usual move is knight f3, but the way the opening worked with IBM's Deep Blue is that effectively to stop the computer having to calculate loads, because the game was timed, so IBM had to use a clock while it was thinking. The team basically just said, well, we're going to program loads of opening repertoire into the machine. So in this position, you always play this move. So the computer didn't need to calculate anything. And that's basically what GMs are doing when they think in their head, oh, this is the Rasputin opening or whatever. I always play this move in this position. So it saves the computer a lot of time. And they've effectively told IBM to play c3 in this position because Garry might not be familiar with this line as much. So a pretty good move there by the IBM team. Anyway, d5, challenging the centre, capturing the centre. Yes, Garry is bringing his queen out early, but when you're world champion Garry Kasparov, you can pretty much do whatever you want. And crucially, this knight can't come here to attack the queen with tempo. So it's actually not a terrible square for the queen. d4, just challenging this pawn, and knight f6. Sorry about that. Okay, knight f6 and knight f3, just usual developing moves. If you're wondering why don't we take the pawn, if I was playing black here, my opponent took the pawn, you have a couple of options. You could retake with the queen, or you could just capture the opponent's queen and say, well, you're never going to castle this game because you have to recapture with your king. And you're not even really gaining a pawn if they recapture with the queen, because black can always just play e5 and threaten to recapture the pawn with the bishop. So not something you want to do. g4, developing a piece with a pin, always good. And if you're ever in this position in your games, the best move is just to if you're ever in a pin in general, you want to deal with it straight away usually, unless there's another problem. If you're ever in this specific pin, there we go. Best way to unpin is just to block with the bishop. You don't want to move the queen, because then if they capture the knight, you'll double your pawns up and then you won't be able to castle kingside because all your pawns will just be shattered. So best move is bishop e2, which is what was played. e6, adding another defender to this pawn, and now you can move the bishop and try and castle kingside. h3, asking Garry Kasparov, world champion Garry Kasparov, the question, what are you going to do with your bishop? Garry just says, well, I'm just going to move it back, and if you want to play g4 and weaken your king, then be my guest. And in fact, IBM does not choose to do that. He says, I'm going to castle, stay safe. And as we learned from last game, castling early is a good thing. Yeah, you don't want to castle too late, otherwise you might never castle at all, and you get Bobby fished. So knight c6, just attacking this pawn and nicely developing. Bishop e3, another developing move. Sort of, a lot of people mentioned the windmill action from last week, and we're not going to have any windmill action this week, but we are going to have some nice X-raying action this week. So the bishop is X-raying that pawn, which means it can't capture it in itself, but it is actually putting pressure on it through the other pawn. So we have a capture in the centre. You don't want to recapture with your bishop here because you don't want to give up your bishop for a knight, especially with this dark square diagonal open. You want your dark square bishop. So capture with the pawn. And in this position, Garry played bishop b4. Now, there might be a couple of reasons behind this. The best move is just to put your bishop here and then castle. It's a bit more defensive, but it's definitely the best move because it just adds a nice defender to the knight, and it's not a terrible square for the bishop. If the knight moves, you might move it out. The reason Garry did this was probably twofold. Number one, IBM is now Deep Blue is now officially off the opening book. All these moves up until this point were just pre-programmed. If Garry plays this, you play this. Now we're off the book. IBM has to calculate all its moves from here. So if IBM's rubbish, he might have played a good opening, but if he's rubbish at calculating stuff, he's just going to lose. Secondly, not this exact position, but if the game were to continue knight c3, queen a5 and queen b3, which is a pretty natural continuation, this would transpose into a position that Kasparov had already played against a player named Vladimir Kraunik. So it's always good to get 12 moves into a position you've already played. However, after bishop b4, IBM goes for a3 first. So we're well off the books now. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we've got, again, asking Garry the question, what are you going to do with your bishop? And he says, I'm going to go back. And now knight c3, attacking the queen. Queen goes back. It's good square for the queen. Got a lot of options. And again, knight b5, further attacking the queen. Unfortunately, in this position, the computer says the best move is to just put your queen back where it came from, and then the knight goes back, and then the queen goes back, and so on and so forth. And eventually, when you've reached the position 3 times, the game is declared a draw. But your world champion Garry Kasparov against very much a challenger computer, you don't want to go for a draw, even if you are the black pieces. So queen e7, knight e5. It's generally just a good idea to advance your pieces as deep into the opponent's camp as you can. So a nice move, and also it opens up a double attack on this bishop. How is it a double attack, you say? Well, the bishop's attacking it, and now, no, the queen's not directly attacking it, but it's another lovely bit of X-ray action. So obviously, if the bishop captures, the knight will recapture, and then you will recapture the knight with your queen. So you don't want to lose 2 pieces for 1. So you're just going to take the bishop and have a nice trade. Garry manages to castle at last, and in this position, the computer rates it's basically even. Like, yep, white's got an isolated pawn in the middle, which Garry's going to try and attack, but the game's very much being fought on black's side of the board, so a bit more space for white. Both players have got compensation. They've both castled. Pawn structure's pretty even, so could go either way, really. In these positions, if you don't really have an active plan, it's usually a good idea to improve your worst piece. So that's exactly what Mr. Deep Blue does. So he brings his rook onto a nice open file. Garry Kasparov follows suit, just opposing the rook, putting his rook in an open file, adds another defender to the knight. And bishop g5. And this is really the problem with the bishop move much earlier in the game, is that there's not really any way to get out of this pin. If you want to, so the pin, you can't move your knight because the queen will be captured. So you could play h6, and after the bishop goes back, you could play g5. However, that severely weakens your king side, and it takes away a defender from the knight. The problem is the knight controls this square, and this square, so the king, the queen can't go to any of those squares. If you go there, you're still in the pin, and the only other thing you might try is queen e8, but then white will just say, well, first I'm going to double your pawns, and now I'm going to play knight to d6 and fork your queen and your rook, and rooks are better than queens. So, I mean, no, they're not. Rooks are better than knights. So you don't want to do that. So g5. Garry plays bishop b6, puts more pressure on this pawn, and defends his own pawn. And now IBM plays bishop captures on f6. So it's a pretty interesting move. You might think, oh, we've just gone on about how great this pin was, how black can't get out of it. Why is IBM giving that up so easily? So I'm just going to try something. So if we go here, the chat should appear on the screen. So keep it kosher. But which piece would you capture back with? Do you want to capture with the queen, or do you want to capture with the pawn? And I'm just going to have some water while you guys decide. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Okay, we've got one for pawn. So let's go back. Oh, we've got one for queen. So we're going to capture the bishop, but what do we want to capture with, the queen or the pawn? So if you said the queen, in general, you'd be right, because we don't want to mess up our pawn structure. However, in this case, if you choose to capture with the queen, you're going to run into knight d7, and now, as I said before, rooks are better than knights. So you're going to lose a knight, you're going to lose a rook, and you're only going to get a knight. So not a thing you want to go into. So you have to accept your pawn's going to get doubled, but it does come with an attack on the knight, so not terrible. Now this is another interesting move, knight c4. You might be thinking, well, in this position, I'm attacking this pawn twice, and it's only defended once. So why wouldn't Deep Blue play knight f3 and add another defender to the pawn? Well, the answer is that, okay, you are attacking it twice and it's defended once, but you're not threatening to take it, because if you play knight captures or bishop captures, either way, IBM's just going to say, okay, I'm going to capture back, and when you recapture, queen g4. And now the king is in check, and you're just going to lose a piece. So, excuse me, blundering a piece is not something you want to do. So, nice move. Knight c4 attacks the bishop. Bishop's not really got any squares. Can't go here. It can't go here. Can't go here without being threatened to be captured. It could go all the way back, but that's a very passive move. So, unfortunately, Garry's going to have to make his peace with the fact that he's going to have to give up his bishop. So just improves his worst piece, and knight captures. And unfortunately, again, you've doubled Garry Kasparov, world champion Garry Kasparov's pawns twice. You know, it's a bit rude if you ask me. But anyway, the game continues. Rook f to d1, f5, just taking this square away from the white queen, so the white queen can't do any nice checks, and queen e3, just improving the position. Queen f6, just defending all these squares, adds another attack to this pawn. And this is another really interesting position, because Deep Blue basically says, well, okay, I've got this isolated pawn, black's attacking it 3 times, I'm defending it 3 times, maybe this rook can get in on the action, I can always defend it, but you don't want to be in such a passive position. So he says, alright, d5, okay, it's attacked twice and defended once, so you are going to lose a pawn. But in fact, Garry Kasparov commented after the game that he would have played d5 here. Just completely ruins black's pawn structure. And after the captures, one of the commentators mentioned that the pawn structure looks like Granny's teeth or something like that. And it is pretty horrible. You've got like all these isolated pawns. 2 of them are doubled. Not nice. And now after b3, the queen was eyeing this pawn, so you just get out of the way. Interestingly, this position is evaluated as dead even, but if you're a human, you'd much rather be playing white. It's a lot harder to defend all these pawns as a human. Computer would have no trouble because they can just calculate everything precisely, but you'd much rather play this, play white as a human. Now, this is quite a critical position because black has a few options in this position. If you ask me, you're playing black and I'll offer you a draw, do you want to take it? I would say definitely if I was playing black, because it's just horrible to play. You've got all these pawns in bad spots and your king's very exposed. So there is a few ways that Garry could have tried for a draw here. One is knight e7. So you're opposing the rook. The best move is for Deep Blue to capture it. And after recaptures, you might think, well, haven't I just lost a knight here? Because when the queen checks me and I have to move, we'll take the knight. Thing is, though, you've got this queen a1 check, and after the king moves and you check again, if the king goes back, you just keep repeating. And again, as I said, if you not the pawn, the queen, if the king goes back, you go back, and so on and so on. You can get a draw that way if the position is repeated 3 times. So the only way to push for anything more than a draw if you're white is to play g3. This, however, runs into queen e2, and now you're threatening to win your knight back, and you're threatening to perpetual check the king. So let's say you defend the knight by moving it here or queen here or something. Black's going to capture the pawn, and then king goes down, queen follows him, king goes back up, queen follows him, and then we've got another draw. So Garry could have gone for a draw that way. Another way, this is probably the only way Garry could have tried to push for a win in this position, is rook d8. And it does give up a pawn, but after d7, it sort of strengthens everything. Everything's nicely defended, and you might be able to push this past pawn. It's your best asset in this position, really. Just get the pawn to the other side. However, world champion Garry Kasparov goes for h8. He's going to get his rook here. He's going to try and make something happen on the g file. So, unfortunately, this does give up a pawn, but no avoiding that, and it's a double pawn anyway. You don't really care. Rook g8 as planned, and in this position you might be thinking, well, I've just won a pawn, why not win another pawn? Problem with capturing this pawn with the queen is that you run into queen g5, and queen g5 threatens to take the rook, and it threatens to checkmate here, and there's no way to defend against both threats. So you've got to play something else. So queen c5, a good move by Mr. Blue. Defends his rook, and now if we play queen g5, you can just meet it with queen g3, and the rook can no longer be captured. d4 by Garry, just the pawn was attacked, he's now defending it twice, so a nice move. And knight d6, attacking this pawn, which is not defended at all, and a double attack on this pawn, which is only defended once. f4, Garry doesn't want to lose this pawn because this is going to be a nice attacking piece for him. And again, next move is quite a materialistic move. It's a move you definitely expect a computer to make, but not really a human in this position, because it's looking a bit nasty, all these ideas going on with the rook and the queen. The knight might be able to jump in. You probably want to shore up your king side, but IBM calculates everything and just says, no, I'm going to take a pawn, and Mr. Garry Kasparov, you do not have an attack. So after the pawn capture, knight e5. And again, there are a few options in this position. If you're thinking, I'll just win another pawn, Mr. Garry Kasparov, you don't have an attack. Mr. Garry Kasparov does have an attack now, because knight f3, you can't recapture because the rook is eyeing the king, and once the king moves, you lose the queen. So not something you want to do. The other option you might think is d6, just getting a knight into the game, because if black plays like a slow move like h6, you can play queen takes knight, and then after the queen recaptures, you can take this pawn with your knight, and that's going to check the king and fork the queen. So you're going to win a pawn, essentially. However, in this position, black can just ignore that and say, well, it's my move. I'm not going to play a slow move. I'm going to play knight f3 check. Again, the pawn can't capture because it's pinned, and after king h1 and queen g6, this is just horrid. You're threatening checkmate. It's not a position you want to play as white. It's defendable, and actually the best defense is just to capture with the knight and distract the queen. And unfortunately, you can't recapture the knight here because you run into queen g7, and now there's no defense against checkmate. So again, not something you want to go into. And in fact, Garry commented after the match that lots of good players would have made mistakes in this position because this attack looks quite potent. But Deep Blue does not make a mistake, and he plays queen d5, just defending this square. f3, Garry just throwing his pieces into the attack, and g3, just keeping all the lines closed. Knight d3, again, Garry needs to make something happen. He's down a pawn, he's in a bad position. White's got these lovely connected passed pawns. If all the material was traded off, White would happily win this game, so this attack needs to work. Now, you might be thinking in this position, well, we had this similar idea before of threatening the rook, which again is undefended, and threatening checkmate. So Queen F4 looks a little bit spicy, but the problem is there's one good defensive resource here for White. If White played something like, I don't know, Rook C5 just to attack this knight twice, now you're getting checkmated because you can give up your rook here with check. Only move really is to recapture, and then the queen comes in here. Again, if you go into the corner, the queen checkmates you here. You come here, queen checks, and you're checkmated. So after queen f4, the best move is rook c8. And now, if you capture the rook, you lose your queen. So Garry may have played queen g5. And again, there are a few mistakes that Deep Blue could make here. If he played something like h4 to drive the queen away, you get rook captures, and you might think, Deep Blue, you've just given up your queen. Okay, Deep Blue, you have just given up your queen, but you're getting checkmated in 4 moves, because the rook comes here, only move for the king is king h2, knight checks, only move for the king is king h3, knight checks again, only move for the king, and now we have a lovely checkmate. The pawn guards this square, the rook guards all the other squares. So, in this position, queen f4 may look good, but not very good. So Garry probably knew this, and he plays knight d3. Rook c7, just putting pressure on the black pawn. And now Garry says, okay, you've left this file. I'm going to try and get my rook involved. Unfortunately, this is a blunder by Garry Kasparov. He thinks he's got an attack again, but he doesn't. He's going to check the king. He's going to throw all his pieces in there, but he's just not quite got he's just not quite got the pieces. If he had one more move, he might be able to make something happen. But as we see, Deep Blue continues, and he says, I don't care if you check me. I'm not going to move my rook back. You can check me if you want with the rook. I'm going to attack your rook and your pawn. What are you going to do? So Garry says, all right, check. King goes into the corner, and knight captures the pawn. Now, you are threatening checkmate here, as world champion Garry Kasparov. Unfortunately, there is nothing you can do to stop all the checks from White. So Deep Blue is going to check you by capturing this knight. Only move really is, well, the best move actually is to capture with the queen. And obviously you can't recapture the queen with the rook, otherwise you will get checkmated. So you have to get a check in first. Now the king moves, and you capture the queen. And okay, black's just given up his queen for a knight and a rook, which isn't terrible, but this is just a winning endgame for White. You could play g4, you could play queen d5 check just to win this pawn, and now black isn't threatening checkmate. Maybe Garry could get his pawn down. It's not completely lost for Garry, but it's pretty bad. However, it's better than what he actually played, which is king g7. And now it's just completely lost. Knight g5 check, discovered attack on the king, king h6, and rook h7 check. And in this position, Mr. World Champion Garry Kasparov resigned the game. Only move for the king here is king g6, and then after king g8 check, king f5, and even just the slow move of knight takes on f3. Black just has nothing here. Like, you're no longer threatening to checkmate. In fact, this would be a mistake because the king goes here. Now one of your pieces is going to drop off. You're also threatening rook here to win the queen. So quite rightly, Garry just says, well, I'm going to resign the game. And yeah, that's the end of the game. It's a pretty interesting one. It was the first time a computer beat the best player that humanity had to offer. Pretty impressive. This is actually a 6-game series. So there's plenty more games in this series. If you liked the IBM v Garry Kasparov action, then I can do a few more of these. There's actually a lot of they met for a rematch in 1997, and there's a lot of controversy around that match because there were accusations of cheating. There were some really wild accusations, like Bobby Fischer was feeding IBM moves because it was making moves you really wouldn't expect a computer to make. But yeah, there's some good games, and there's a really nice 19-move miniature in that series. So if you fancy that, then maybe we'll do that next time. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your weekend, and you're not getting too bored indoors. and I'll see you next week. So goodbye.